what year was it? This was your father. Your father was a professional. He was a doctor. What happened? Just lead us up to it. What was the marriage like prior to the murder?
Well, my parents were in the middle of getting a divorce at that time. But leading up to that, like I wasn't, I thought that I led a normal life for the most part. And I had a father who was a doctor, and he wasn't around a lot. And when he was around, he wasn't very nice to us. But I just kind of thought, well, I'm a lucky kid because I had friends whose, families they were from single parent households because their parents had gone through divorce. And I thought, well, I have a family unit that seems to be, intact, I suppose. And it wasn't until I started getting older, right? So I was, 9, 10, and then 11. And that's when my father introduced me to his girlfriend. And he told me he was a patient of his, but then I saw him kiss her. And this is just sort of the Cliff Notes version. I saw him kiss her in a romantic way. I'd never seen that before. And I said, and he asked me to lie about it to my mother and lie about the gift that she had gotten me, because this was on Father's Day, 1989. And I, of course, did lie to my mother. I was afraid of my father. And I also was like, you're stuck in the middle as a child. But then I felt so guilty about it that the next day I did tell her. And I sat her down. I said, Mommy, I think that, I called her Mommy, of course. I said, I think Daddy's having an affair. Because I had seen these things on television, right? I'd seen them in movies. I was old enough to sort of understand that those things work. And plus I had friends whose fathers had affairs. But I just didn't think it would happen to me. And that was the moment my mother drew the line in the sand. She said, I'm upset that you lied to me, but I'm glad that you told me the truth. And I'm sorry that your father put you in that position. And then she called him up and said, listen here, you son of a bitch. You crossed the line in the sand, because unbeknownst to me, for decades that my parents were together, they had a sort of pact, which was my father could do whatever he wanted. This was not the first time. She already knew about the girlfriend. She even knew the girlfriend was pregnant. She knew about all of them. And the deal is because I was my mother's constant companion, she said, you can do whatever you want, Jack. My father's name was Jack Boyle. You can do whatever you want. Just don't involve our kid. And that was the moment that, of course, like any typical narcissist, sociopath, psychopath in my father's case, they push those boundaries, and because they don't apply to them. And that's what he did. And ultimately, she drew the line in the sand and said, enough is enough. And he said, well, of course, they're the injured one. And then he took her life in a premeditated way.
He's still in prison. Is that right?
He is still incarcerated to this day. So what happened is over, just to sort of get into it, is I woke up in the middle of the night on New Year's Eve, 1989. I had heard what I believe was a scream. And then I heard 2 loud thuds and some muttering. That was my father's voice, very low. I couldn't make out what he was saying. And then I counted his footsteps as he walked down the hallway. And I was asleep. I pretended to be asleep in my bed. And I always slept with my door open, and I could see his feet in the doorway out of my peripheral vision. And something was telling me, don't look up. And I didn't. I somehow went back to sleep after the feet left. Went back to sleep. I woke up the next morning. I ran to my mother's bedroom, and I started scrunging through rummaging through the sheets, looking for blood. And I came downstairs, and my father was on the couch, and he had just taken a shower. He had a towel around his waist. He was watching CNN. And I said, where is my mother? And he ignored me. And I said, where is my mother? And he looked at me and he said, well, Collier, Mommy took a little vacation. And from that moment, I knew that he had killed her. And he then started launching into this whole diatribe of how we're not going to call the police. We're not going to call the FBI. And mind you, I grew up in a really small town in Ohio. And my whole family, both my parents, our entire families, we're all from Philadelphia, like suburban Philadelphia, like mainline area, Ardmore, that area. And I, so we had been in Mansfield, this like small town in Ohio, for a few years. But the fact that my father says to me, we're not going to call the FBI, was like, what are you talking about? Even at that age, there was no CSI on television. But I thought, that's really extreme. I'm like, okay, something is happening. And then he starts brainstorming about where my mother could have gone. And this is the interesting thing with the Anna Walsh case is he starts brainstorming like, oh, well, maybe she, he says that she got into a car. She came downstairs. They got into an argument. And she threw her purse and her credit cards at him. Now, he also told me that the sound that I heard was her throwing the purse. So I don't know how I hear the thud upstairs. The thud's upstairs, and then the purse was thrown downstairs. And that she, in the dead of winter in Ohio, walked out the door, no coat, no anything, walked down our driveway, which must have been a good, 30, 40 yards in the snow, and got into a car that was waiting at the end of the driveway and left. And he then started hypothesizing, oh, she went to Washington, D.C., or maybe she's contacted because my uncle lived in Washington, D.C., worked for the Department of Navy. He started into all these sort of, false hypotheses. And the thing that caught me is we're not going to call the police. And I waited until he left. And my mother just purchased a cordless phone. I took the cordless phone upstairs because my grandmother was in the house. My father's mother had arrived the night before, and she was very close with my mother. And she arrived the night before, and she said, okay, we're going to listen to your father. We're not going to call anybody. We're going to find out your mom's okay. She's going to come back. And I'm thinking to myself, that's not happening. So I took this cordless photo and went upstairs, and I had this stuffed Garfield, like a Santa Claus Garfield, and I had written down all my mother's friends' phone numbers and stuffed them in this hat in case there was an emergency. Took the list out, and I started calling all of them. And I told them what happened, and I said, you need to call the police, because I can't call the police, because my dad said, you can't call the police. Mm-hmm. I don't want to disobey, but you call the police. Two uniformed officers showed up in a black and white, and they started asking questions. My grandmother is apoplectic at this point because she thinks I call the police. And she's following me around the whole time in the house, and I'm trying to tell them what I heard, taking them in the bedroom, but I can't do any of that. And the officers left, and I heard nothing. And the next day I called my mother's friends again when I got a chance, and they said that it was a missing persons case. And I said to them, she's not missing. Like, she's missing, but we know what happened. She's dead, or she's been kidnapped somewhere or something. Like, she's incapacitated somehow, or else she would be here with me and my sister. And that same day, a detective just happened to show up to the house because he had nothing to do. It was New Year's Day. So this is interesting. Saw the missing persons report. This is kind of weird. A doctor's wife goes missing on New Year's Eve. He comes to the house, and that is when my grandmother loses it, and she goes to call my father because he gets his way into the house because I let him in. I'm like, come on in, yeah, come on in, talk to us. And he, my grandmother is just screaming at him. She's like, I'm going to go call my son. He's a doctor. We're going to sue you. She goes to get the phone. I pull him aside. I said, look, my mother's not just missing. My mother is dead. I need to talk to you. Give me your card. And he gave me his business card. And it wasn't until that following day, which would have been January 2nd, 1990, when I went back to school, I went into the principal's office and I said, I need you to call this guy from the Mansfield Police Department and get him down here. I need to talk to him, because school was my safe zone, because my father was gone. My grandmother was gone, and I was at school trying to be a normal kid, and my mom has disappeared. And I knew that I could talk to him. And that's what I did. And he came down to the school and I laid everything out. I told him about my history, my father's affair, the mistress, the nasty divorce, my father's proclivity for violence with us growing up, and everything that was going on in the home. And I said, look, I'm going to go home, and I'm going to go upstairs where we have a crawl space where there's a bookshelf, and I'm going to pull that bookshelf out. I'm going to look for her body or clues, or I'm going to try to find her purse, because I knew she would never leave her house without this one purse. And I think I legit think that he thought I was crazy. But this started the whole investigation. And that's when they started looking at my father, and they started sending, kept coming to the house to try to talk to my dad and say, hey, can I talk to Dr. Boyle? And then, of course, my father's divorce attorney was there. And he said, no, we're not going to talk to anyone. And then, of course, the media is calling, like people are like, okay, so what's going, much like this case. It's like almost a carbon copy in a lot of ways.
Well, your wherewithal at that age is unreal. Like, I don't think I would have that at my current age. And it reminds me in some ways of my mother's story. My mother, as you know, Collier, is a Holocaust survivor, and her father was taken from her at their front door in Yugoslavia. She was 4.5, and she was hidden in a Catholic school for boys and had to pretend among all the nuns and all the other people in there that she was Catholic and had to say Catholic prayers, and that she was a boy. So it's amazing the strength people get, especially at these young ages, being able to be nimble on their feet, if you will.